Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we talk about propagating plants with hardwood cuttings. So let's go. Did you know that there is an easy, fun way to propagate plants from cuttings during the winter months? Well, there is, and that's what this video is all about. This video is going to be divided into two parts. The first part talks all about hardwood cuttings, when you take them, why you take them, and different plants you can take them from. And then the second part of the video shows you the actual process of taking the cuttings. This winter, I'll be taking hardwood cuttings from a number of plants that I listed in this video. So I'll be giving you updates later in the season on how the cuttings are doing. One thing I'm going to be changing for this year is instead of putting the hardwood cuttings inside of black plastic containers, I'm actually going to be reusing something that I already have on hand, and that's gallon milk jug containers. Part of the reason I want to use these translucent containers is so that I can actually see the roots forming on the sides of the container. I find that when I use those black pots, I'm very tempted to want to pull the cuttings out and see if roots have formed. Now, you usually want to wait until you see roots forming on the bottom of the container, but if you use a container that's translucent or even clear, then at least you can see the roots forming and you know that things are happening beneath soil level. So now let's go over what hardwood cuttings are. In this video, I'm going to go over a number of things, which includes what are hardwood cuttings? When can you take them? What kind of plants can you take hardwood cuttings from? And what kind of plants can you not take hardwood cuttings from? So let's start with what is a hardwood cutting. It's basically a stem or a piece of a plant that you take for the purpose of propagating, which means you want to make an identical copy of the parent plant that you're taking the cutting from. So let's start with when would you take your hardwood cuttings? The optimal time for taking hardwood cuttings is when the plant is actually dormant. So that typically happens when the leaves have dropped, and that's usually the late fall during the winter months. And you can still take hardwood cuttings even in the early spring months, but you want to do it before the buds start forming on that plant. One tip that I've learned about is you want to avoid taking your cuttings on an extremely frosty day. And the best thing I can advise you is experiment with cuttings. Try taking some hardwood cuttings during the fall time. Try taking some cuttings during the cold winter months. And then try taking some cuttings from that same plant during the very early spring months and see which process works best for you. But even then, some factors that you want to keep in mind is your schedule. Some say that early spring is the best time to take a hardwood cutting. But for me, I have a backyard plant nursery. I'm usually very busy with that. I have my own home garden that keeps me busy. And then I have other things going on in the springtime. So I'm definitely going to be experimenting with taking my cuttings at a lot of different times. I'm going to start now during the late fall, early winter months. I'm going to take a bunch during the cold winter months, and then some, if I have time and if I have a chance, during the very early spring. And you might be wondering, well, why would I even want to take hardwood cuttings? And I'm going to tell you why. We mentioned earlier that it's a great way to propagate plants. And that's so true. If you want to add a certain plant in your landscape and you want more of it, it's a great way to add to your landscape. And it's not only a great way to add to your landscape, it ensures that you're going to get an identical copy of the parent plant. Sometimes when you collect the seeds from certain plants, you're not going to get an identical copy, but when you take hardwood cuttings, you definitely will. Another reason why you would want to take hardwood cuttings is, well, when you think about it, a lot of us are often pruning trees, shrubs, bushes anyway. And a lot of us end up just getting rid of the material that we've pruned. Well, why waste it? During the late winter, early spring, you can take those cuttings and you can get them to root to create new plants. So before I give you the list of plants that you can take hardwood cuttings from, I definitely want to tell you about the plants that you don't want to take hardwood cuttings from. Any plant that has a patent to it, you don't want to take cuttings from that. It's illegal, it's against the law. When you think about it, the person that has the patent on that plant has put in a lot of time, a lot of effort into growing that plant. And for that reason, they've created a patent on it. Now, it's up to you if you want to follow that rule or not, but I definitely had to put that out there. But if you're like me and you're selling plants as part of a business, then you definitely don't want to be taking hardwood cuttings from patented plants and be selling those. And usually the plant tag will tell you if there's a patent on that plant. And if you're not sure, you can always look that up on the internet as well. So now you might be wondering, that's great, but which plants can I take hardwood cuttings from? There are so many, you would be surprised. And what I did for you was I did some research and I put together a fairly comprehensive list of plants that do well with hardwood cuttings. But while I give you this list, just know that it might not be 100% complete. And also keep in mind that not any two plants are created equally when it comes to hardwood cuttings. And what I mean by that is some of these plants will take to root very easily with hardwood cuttings. Some might be a challenge. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about trying this process. And there's a lot of great information on the internet. You could just do a search on hardwood cuttings and then the name of plant that you're interested in taking cuttings from, just so you can find some more detailed information on that particular plant. And as I list off these plants, I'll pop the information up on the screen on the name of the plant, the typical growing zone, and a picture or an example of each of these plants. We have Abelia. There's also the American beautyberry, American sycamore, apple, apricot, azalea, blueberry, bottlebrush, boxwood, butterfly bush or buddleia, common jasmine, camellia, currant, deutzia, dogwood, eastern cottonwood, elderberry, fig, forsythia, gooseberry, grape, hardy kiwi, holly, honey locust, honeysuckle, hydrangea, mock orange, mulberry, ninebark, peach, pear, plum, poplars, privet or ligustrum, pussy willow, quaking aspen, rhododendron, rose. Typically the shrub or the old-fashioned heirlooms root the best with hardwood cuttings, rose of Sharon, sand cherry, snowberry, spirea, strawberry bush, trumpet vine, viburnum, Georgia creeper, weigela, willow, and wisteria. Again, I might be missing other plants that do well with hardwood cuttings, but that's a pretty good list for you to go by. Next, let's go over how to take hardwood cuttings and what to do with them once you've taken them. It's important to know a couple of key things when you're taking your hardwood cuttings. The first thing is to know what is considered a node. A node is also referred to as a leaf joint, bud, or bud union, and it's where the leaf breaks out from the stem. When you're taking your hardwood cuttings, it's important to take the right type of cutting. What you're looking for is fresh this year's or 1 year growth, which is light brown or red in color. Normally, it's not going to be a dark gray color because typically that will be the older growth from previous years. You also want to avoid taking any thin or wispy stems that are going to be weak. In terms of the thickness of your cutting, it's best if it's about as thick as a pencil, and I prefer to take cuttings that are straight. I don't want a bunch of cuttings that are curving one way or the other. For a cutting instrument, I like to use hand pruners. Just make sure that they've been sterilized, and I like to sterilize mine with rubbing alcohol. When it comes to the size of your cuttings, you can definitely start with large cuttings and then cut them down to size, or you can cut them to the exact size that you want them to be. A good general recommendation on what size your cutting should be that you're going to be sticking should be somewhere around 8 to 12 inches. When I am taking my cuttings off of, let's say, my hydrangea, I prefer to take the cutting right above a leaf node. I don't want to just take it willy-nilly wherever I want. It's not required, but if you do want to keep it nice and tidy on your plant, then you definitely want to cut right above a leaf node. It's very important to know which side is up on your cutting. In other words, if you plant your cutting upside down, it's not going to do anything for you. So as you're collecting your cuttings, do something that will make it easier for you to remember which side is the top and which side is the bottom. Also, if you're going to be collecting a variety of cuttings from different plants, make sure you keep them labeled or organized in a way so you don't forget what is what. Oftentimes, when it comes to cuttings, you hear about the term sticking the cuttings. Well, what does that mean? It's basically taking the cutting and sticking it into something so that it can grow. Some options are you can stick your cuttings in the ground or in a trench. And you only want to be doing that if your ground hasn't frozen. But if you're going to just be putting the cuttings somewhere in your landscape, in a flower bed, make sure you label the cutting. You don't want to forget it because come springtime, it might just look like a stick to you. Another option is you can stick your cuttings in some sort of a container or pot. The key is make sure that that container or pot has drainage holes in the bottom of it. It can really be any size that you want. You could even try something like a large plug tray. For your potting media or soil that you're going to be using, you want to make sure that you pick something that is well draining, but also that can retain moisture. And then finally, it needs to be something that can support those stems that you're going to be sticking into it. My experience in the past is potting mix has worked for me. It's nice to use something that is either peat moss or cocoa coir based mixed with some perlite. I've seen some people use just plain old coarse sand, and they have basically a holding area or a holding bed that's almost like a raised bed out in their yard, and they just stick their hardwood cuttings in there. When I've done hardwood cuttings in the past, I've just used a plain old pot, and that's what I'm going to use this time. So the first thing you would want to do is you would want to fill your pot with the potting medium that you're going to use, which for me is used potting mix. And then you want to just make sure you remove any air pockets, but don't overly compress the potting mix. Give your potting mix a nice drink of water before you start sticking the cuttings in it. And then comes the fun part, basically preparing your cuttings. And then you want to cut them down to size, somewhere around 8 to 12 inches. It can be a little bit shorter, it can be a little bit longer. Don't stress too much about it. It's just a general guideline. And if your cutting or cuttings have any side branches on them, you want to remove those. At the bottom, make a straight cut just below a node. And that way it's easier to push it into the potted media. At the top, you want to make a slanting cut above a node so that you know the top from the bottom and so that the water runs off outside, preventing any rot. A typical cutting should have about 3 nodes, if not more, on it. You want at least 2 nodes below soil surface so that at least one of those 2 nodes will create roots. And then you want at a minimum 1 node above soil surface. That's where the leaves will come out as well as the branches. I want to share a couple of optional things, both of which I've tried and both which worked for me and I'm going to be doing again. One of them is wounding the base, which is basically scraping the wood just below that bottom leaf node. What that does is it basically opens it up so that it makes it easier for that cutting to root. Another option is you can use rooting hormone. There's so many different kinds of rooting hormones out there. What I'll do is I'll put up on the screen the 2 rooting hormones that I like to use. Since I'm using a round pot, when it comes to my cuttings, I'm going to be placing them on the outside circle of the pot. And the reason is I want the cuttings to get better drainage this way. And remember, you want to have at least 2 or 3 nodes below soil surface and at least 1 or 2 nodes above soil surface. So percentage-wise, that might come out to 2/3 of your cutting is below soil surface and 1/3 of your cutting is above soil surface. And then you can go ahead and you can water your pot or your container again. So now what do you do with your pot? That's a good question. You want to store it somewhere where it's protected. And what I mean by that is you don't want it out where it's super windy and the elements are very harsh. You're trying to basically be gentle with your cuttings, but not too gentle because they're dormant and they can still take a lot. You can store your cuttings in a shed, in a garage, a cold frame, under a cloche. The big thing is just make sure that the temperatures are consistent and cool. So if you do choose to stick them in the ground because maybe your ground has not frozen, it'll be fine. I know that sounds weird, but trust me, if you are able to stick your cuttings in the ground because the ground is still thawed out, what's going to happen is those cuttings are just going to sit there. They're going to just wait until the time and the conditions are right. and they will then start doing what they need to do to create those roots. It might snow on them. The ground might freeze after you've stuck them in the ground. That is all okay. And those cuttings don't need much more water after that. So for me, I'm going to be storing my cuttings in a number of different places, and one of them will be in my garage. I'll check on them once a month. I don't want the cuttings to 100% dry out, but I also don't want the soil to be waterlogged. So if I have to, I can just add the smallest drink of water, but that's about it. I'm also going to be putting some cuttings in my cold frame. That's going to freeze out there because our temperatures are very cold during the winter months. So I won't have to water those cuttings again until the springtime. And then the final pot of cuttings, I'm just going to have them out in the elements. I'm also not going to have to water those until the springtime. Let me share a couple of tips. I wouldn't take too many cuttings all at once because you want to just do what you can handle in one sitting. And let's say you did take way too many cuttings and now you're not able to stick them all on the same day. You can store them and put them in a cool area. And I'm not going to go into detail about that process. You can look that up. You can research it on how to store hardwood cuttings over an extended period of time. But it is possible to do. Okay, so we've taken our cuttings and we've stuck them and we've put our containers where we want them to go. Now what? Well, the waiting game begins. And this process requires a lot of patience. In fact, those cuttings won't do anything for a long time. They're just going to sit there. They're going to be dormant. Eventually, as the temperatures warm up, what will happen is the bottom of the cuttings, you know, the ones that you stuck in the soil, those are going to callus over. And the callus is basically, it's like a whitish color. It's almost like our skin, how our skin calluses over when we get a cut. The same thing. That cutting is going to callus over. And eventually, from that callus, the roots will form. But the roots might not form for a little while. In other words, you might see in the springtime, the top of your cuttings are starting to leaf out. They're starting to create leaves, which is so exciting, so much fun to see. But if you were actually to try to tug and pull that cutting out, you might be surprised and say, but there's no roots. The plant is still doing what it needs to do. And that's where the patience comes into play. So I really advise you not to be tugging and pulling at those cuttings for a long time, because the more you pull them and tug them and look at them, the less likelihood is that those cuttings will take. So just play the waiting game and let the cuttings do what they need to do, knowing that they might leaf out well before they even send their roots out. Now, if any of you have ever taken cuttings during the summer or any sort of semi-hardwood cuttings, you might be wondering, why would I even bother with hardwood cuttings? I think it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy the process. I think it's a great thing to do during the winter months. And the reality is, maybe you missed the window to take those semi-hardwood cuttings. So taking hardwood cuttings gives you another option as well. Now remember, come springtime, don't let those cuttings dry out. And I'll be making update videos to remind you about that, but you want to make sure you're giving those cuttings what they need in terms of water. You don't want to overwater them, but you also don't want them to dry out. You may end up having to water them almost every day, in fact. And those cuttings that I'm going to be putting inside of my cold frame, come springtime, as the temperatures start heating up, I don't want those cuttings to fry. So I am going to have to open up the cold frame a little bit each day during the daytime, just so that it doesn't get too hot inside of the cold frame. And those cuttings that I'm going to have in my garage, I'm going to eventually have to harden them off and get them used to the outdoor elements. Remember when I talked about being patient? Well, it might take 2 or 3 years to get a nice sizable plant out of this cutting. I think it's worth the process. I think it's a lot of fun to watch a small little piece of a cutting turn into a nice established plant. It just will take a little while. So definitely know that and be patient about it. And when it comes to transplanting that cutting, it might not be until late summer, if not the following season. So it's going to be a little while before you have to worry about transplanting it. In future videos, I'll also show you my process for fertilizing those cuttings, as well as transplanting them when the time is right. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please drop it down in the comment section below. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.